Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here, organized by the meeting. And thank you very much to FederlegnoArredo and its president and director for collaborating to the organization of this event. The title of the event is "The Self as the Expression of Authenticity, Design as a Synthesis of History and Culture." The self, this individual, this person is always authentic in itself, but in a contemporary world, which is always changing, there is a challenge ahead. How can everything be conceived as in life, work, and what is surrounding us? The new challenges make us look for something new, for new horizons, also to bridge the gap, to fill the lack that we feel of, in line with the creative needs of modern times. The richest traditions of history and civilization now have to go beyond their stereotypes and the stereotyped way they look at the world in order to find new forms to enhance tradition. They don't have to reject the tradition as occurred in the 1980s. In the 1980s, the truth, authenticity was not that important, whereas in current world, there's art, architecture, design, and they must be authentic. And that applies to all cultures. And cultures continue to meet, even thanks to new technologies. That leads to a challenge, as in always looking for something new, the search for something new. And that also applies to projects. And this is also felt by designers and architects. We have with us different speakers, as you can see, and they come from different cultures and different fields of expertise. So I will ask them a few questions, and they will answer through their own experience with their presentation. Now, the questions are the following. How can a creative experience develop? Why is the self the creator? When making design and when making projects, what is the most important thing? The fact that the creative thing must be useful or creation in itself? And how can tradition, history, and culture influence the final result? I will immediately give the floor to James Biber, who is a very famous world architect, and he designed the US Pavilion at Expo 2015. Thank you very much, Mr. Biber. I give you the floor.
Grazie Chiara, grazie Federlegno e buongiorno a tutti. That's the end of my Italian. I'm sorry, I'll do the rest of this in English. Perfect, thank you. So I begin with the idea that every act of creation is a search for identity. It is my perspective of architecture, it's my perspective of design, but I think it's also a universal idea. It's as old as cave paintings, this notion of establishing an identity. It's true of symbols, as old and new symbols, of art, of artists attempting to establish an identity, a voice, national symbols, icons, commercial symbols, writing, of course. even movies, the idea of authentic characters and authentic identity, of artists establishing their own identity, and even of music. And I have to say, this is here because my wife designed this, so full disclosure. It's also true when I was looking for my own graphic identity. I needed an identity to understand who I was, who I am as an architect. And so I think that this idea is true for everyone and for every act of creation, but it's also true, therefore, that every building is an act of biography. Every building is somehow a biography, a story of the creator, or of a story of some kind. So it's true of famous buildings and historic buildings, standing as kind of cultural icons of any age. It's especially true of individual acts of innovation and creation. I know there's an exhibit here I'm anxious to see about Brunelleschi's dome. And we call it Brunelleschi's dome because it is an act of identity in some sense. Things like the Galleria, and even modern architecture, the Villa Savoy, Le Corbusier is establishing a kind of international identity. Or newer buildings like Centre Pompidou as an identity both for architects but also for culture and for art. And especially now, architects more and more lend their own identity to projects which may otherwise not exist. And there's something called the Bilbao effect, in which a famous building can completely transform a city. And on something I designed myself, a building for a cultural icon like Harley-Davidson. I'll show you more of that later. So, 2 case studies. One of them is my favorite cemetery in Milano, Cimitero Monumentale, in which you could say the final act of creation, the final act of identity for a person is their resting place. And what's remarkable about this cemetery is it's a kind of city of the dead. It's a city of buildings, but each of them is unique, and each of them says something very important about the creator. So they can imitate old buildings. They can move more into a modern era, or even a 1930s style, a kind of squat style, Art Nouveau style, a very modern style. This may be an auditorium at MIT, or it may be a mausoleum. And even the simplest, the most blank image is in fact a statement of identity. Including a mausoleum for an astronomer, etched with astronomical indicators. So, that is a kind of very special case. Right now in Milan, there's another parade of identity, the Expo. And it's a parade of national identity, of corporate identity. I encourage everyone to see it. I know for some reason not everybody has, but the attendance these days is absolutely astonishing. And what you see when you're there is not so much an expo about food, but in my opinion, an expo about design, a competition, if you will, about design, almost an Olympics about design. So these pavilions, these national pavilions, like Chile, building this kind of beautiful, fragile wooden box floating above the ground. Or Poland also building a box, but doing a very interesting thing, renaming their country #Poland. France in another kind of wooden construction, looking more like a store than a pavilion. Or Malaysia, Slovakia, doing things sometimes I just don't understand. China attempting to establish its own field, its own country almost in front of its pavilion. Or the UK with its incredible interest in gardens, establishing a kind of beehive in a field as the experience. Uruguay, Argentina as a kind of industrial agricultural building. And surprisingly, Bahrain as an exquisitely beautiful, small, almost domestic scale building. You could almost miss it, it's so small, but in fact it's one of the most powerful pavilions. And as well, a pavilion, not even a pavilion, an outdoor space for the Duomo, for the Milan Duomo, in which the sculpture on top of the Duomo is brought down to eye level so you can appreciate what you can never see. Something that's 100 meters in the air is now right in front of you. Santa Sede, with extremely simple, beautiful statements about daily bread. And very complicated constructions for Chinese construction companies, a sustainable farm pavilion for New Holland that is filled with plastic, again, something I don't exactly understand. And Holland as a big park, as a kind of fun festival, something I do understand. Brazil, in a kind of gesture towards Carnival, makes a mesh, a climbing mesh that you traverse on the way into the pavilion. And Turkey making a kind of outdoor bazaar. And so each of these, I think, says quite a bit about the national identity, whether intended or not intended. They're quite explicit messages. And then finally, the pavilion I designed for the US, which we'll talk about a bit more. So if every building is a biography, the real question becomes, well, whose biography is it? And who, in fact, is this building about? And I think that's an interesting question because it was once clear, and it's now less clear. And it's less clear how identity is being used by clients and by architects. So is this biography about the architect? Is it about the client or the cultural context or the physical context or the user? This is a question I think every architect needs to ask themselves as they're designing. My fear is that more and more architects are lending or clients are requesting that architects lend them their own identity, replacing the identity of the institution. And so some very important institutions, in fact, have become subsumed by the architect's identity. And so if you look, this is a view out the window of my office in New York. And I'm in a building called the Woolworth Building, and looking across the way, the tallest building there is a building called New York by Gehry. And so Frank Gehry, the architect of the building, has actually become the identity of New York. So New York is now owned by Frank Gehry in some sense. And it's a very clever marketing idea, but it begs the question, who owns this idea and whose identity is being sold? You could also look at this project in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, by an architect, Santiago Calatrava. It's a new wing to the Milwaukee Museum of Art, an important art museum, but a wing that has become so dominating and so overwhelms the art that it is now called the Calatrava. So one doesn't go to the Milwaukee Museum of Art anymore, they go to the Calatrava. Just a few miles down the river in Milwaukee is another museum, a museum I designed for the Harley-Davidson Company, and no one will ever say that they're going to the Biber. Because the museum is really designed for Harley-Davidson, for the most enthusiastic Harley-Davidson devotee, and for everyone who has never seen a Harley-Davidson. And that is the job that I think is the job of an architect, not to replace an important cultural icon like Harley-Davidson with my own identity, but to actually to eke out and to discover what the identity of the user and the client really is. So the building is like Harley-Davidson, tough. It's a factory. Harley-Davidson by its devotees is called the Factory. It sits on an old factory site, a brownfield site. It's made of heavy pieces of steel. Harley-Davidson is a very heavyweight motorcycle, and that's part of their culture, part of their heritage. And you can see it has the appearance of a factory. It's a complex of buildings, not a single building, but a complex of buildings like a factory town. Instead of signage, the names of Harley-Davidson are actually in the brick, and so this use of black brick, you know, a bit like a black motorcycle jacket, embossed motorcycle jacket, is the way that all the graphic identity is played out on the building. This is 5 meters high, signage facing a highway. And 1903 is not the address, but the founding year of Harley-Davidson. A lot of people think it's the address, actually. And so this from the riverside is the appearance, and it has all the appearance of a factory, and yet it functions perfectly as a museum. And so it is, in fact, the proudest thing about this museum for me is that people who are absolute devotees, absolute enthusiasts for Harley-Davidson go to this museum and feel completely comfortable. They think it's really for them. And yet people who have never seen a Harley-Davidson understand it as an identity, as a strong identity of Harley-Davidson. This is the first building Harley-Davidson ever built for the public. They never built anything other than a factory before this, or a showroom. And even inside, the idea of factory has continued. And so there's a display of about 350 motorcycles and thousands of artifacts in a space that might just as well be a factory. So these highly polished objects look fantastic in this very rough space. And finally, the symbol, the logo of Harley-Davidson, what they call the bar and shield, is made into a three-dimensional object and trapped in a cage of steel. This is exactly the way Harley-Davidson thinks of its shiny motors, trapped in this kind of cage of steel that is the motorcycle. It's the jewel in the cage, as they put it. So at the other end of this, so building for a cultural icon is difficult. Building for a national identity is nearly impossible. And the idea of a single building representing the United States, a country as complex, as contradictory as the United States, is a daunting task. The pavilion at Expo is a reaction, in some sense, to the history of the pavilions that the U.S. has built at other expos, which increasingly have become opaque and insular and territorially enclosed, protective, let's say. And so it was our idea to invert this idea, to open up the pavilion, to make it as transparent, as accessible, as porous, and as easy to understand as possible. At the same time, avoiding overly sculptural expressions and hewing to a very somewhat functional, agricultural, one could say, even barn-like set of structures, including displaying pieces of technology and machinery like the large green, like I should gesture behind me, like the large green biodigester in the back. Along one side is a gigantic vertical farm. The vertical farm is it's a hydroponic farm, and it's actually growing crops. It's not just a decorative green wall. It's actually a farm, and it's the idea of a landscape tipped 90 degrees vertically and gridded, because if you fly over the U.S. landscape, one of the remarkable things about it is that it's a completely gridded country. In 1785, the whole of the United States west of the Mississippi was gridded, and it still remains as a visible pattern. And so the grid is an important part of the identity of U.S. agriculture. The pavilion is entered through a large ramp. We are very proud of the fact that there are virtually no lines, no queues at the pavilion. 2 days ago, we had a record number of people at the pavilion. 45,000 people visited the pavilion in a single day. Over 2 million have visited it so far, and there's almost never a queue. On the same day that we had a $45,000 attendees, there were 3-hour waits at other pavilions. And so this idea that we designed it to be as accessible as possible turns out to be very valuable. The green farm, the vertical farm, forms a screen to the inside, filtering light. The boardwalk, the wooden path you walk on, is actually recycled wood from the Coney Island Boardwalk, a very famous seaside promenade in New York City that was destroyed in Hurricane Sandy, and so we were lucky enough to get the lumber and be able to use it as the boardwalk. And of the 3 levels, the top level, the rooftop, is the most unprogrammed. There are events, there is a bar, there's relaxation, so it's a place that anyone can use to relax, to sit in the shade, and you're shaded by a digital glass roof, a roof made of glass that switches from opaque to clear instantaneously. And so we use it as a kind of large-scale display. It's almost a gigantic video screen with pixels 1 meter by 3 meters. There are no American flags at the American Pavilion. The State Department didn't seem to notice that, but we do have a logo that's like an American flag. And at one point they said, well, it's flaggy enough, you know, to be a flag. The digital glass roof. Because the US government gives no money to the Expo Pavilion, everything is privately financed, and so things like the Bertram American Bar and lots of other spaces are branded. It's just the nature of our method. And then the roof terrace, filled with furniture, by the way, from Massimo Vignelli, a very important designer born in Milan, practiced in New York. And the pavilion at night. And then finally, we'll see if this works. The pavilion is always in motion. The idea of an agricultural machine was much more the idea than a fixed building. And so if this works, you'll see what I mean. Ah, there we go. So oh, that's too bad. Well, that's only once. You only get to see once. So the building is in constant motion and appears much more to be a machine than a fixed building. And crisis over. Thank you very much. Grazie mille.
Grazie a James Biber per l'interessantissimo.
Thank you, James Biber, for your very interesting presentation, and you also used the time you were allotted, so thank you very much. So now the floor goes to Andrea Cancellato, who's General Director of the Triennale in Milan. He will talk about the project of recovery of the Triennale exhibition and the creation of the design museum that was created to give an important stage to Italian design in the world. And this presentation is also linked to the fact that today, this year, at the meeting in the Federlegno area, there is also an exhibition of the Italian design of the Triennale exhibition with its permanent collection. So now the floor goes to Director Mr. Cancellato. Thank you very much. I will show you a video in my presentation in which you will see the different editions of our Triennale Museum in Milan, and would like to comment on our work a little bit. Well, when we decided to create the Museum of Design, though Italy is a reference for design in its international level, we had a problem. How can we give this experience a value? How can we emphasize fairly this experience? That is, we didn't want to create just one more design museum, international design museum, just as is the case in many different museums of contemporary arts in many places in the world. That is, museums where objects are basically the same. There's everyday objects that you can find when you visit a design museum, Le Corbusier, Castiglioni, or Magistretti's items, or Philip Stark's chairs, for example. Well, those are really standard objects that everybody knows they can find in design museums. So the question was, to what extent do we really want to visit a design museum or the same design museum to go and see objects that we know already? Well, besides one visit, maybe one may pay one more visit to accompany somebody else, but just think about it. How many times have you gone to see the Mona Lisa at the Louvre? Maybe 1, 2, 3 times on average. Well, if that's our availability, that we want to see the Mona Lisa 3 times, probably we will be open to see more times the same museum with the same items that are icons of our cultural landscape. So what are our choices? Our choices are meaningful not just for the museum itself, but we really wanted to give a certain value to the objects. It's a specialized museum. It's fully Italian, and since the Italian design is important, it must be known very well. Then it's an important museum because it changes every year. The scientific board, the setting, and the topic, the general topic. There's always the same question: what is Italian design? And so far we've given 8 answers. Design as ever-present obsessions, the relation with history and culture of our country until the antiquity, thus changing the date of the origin of our design, then speed from futurism, for example, and then overlapping, for example, having different objects one on top of the other, or comfort, simplicity, usage of humble material, and poor art. Then we had another edition with the design of numbered series or out of series items, unique items, and the multiple with no end. We had design as a representation of our everyday life or the things that we are. Unfortunately, here the video is not in line with what I'm talking about in my presentation, but you will be able to match the different shows to the things I'm mentioning. Then the design as the only sector that is able to import brains, ideas, and projects, and then design and the project of representing communication. Then graphic art, not just as an art, but also as a tool for communication objects and as a part and parcel of a fundamental part of the project. Italian design also as a result of international influence. Some artists were influenced by hymns or Scandinavian artists. Others followed Far East influences or disorders or Indian colors and so on. Then design as capacity to react to crisis or total freedom, inventing materials that are still being used, such as bakelite or glass flax and other materials invented in the 30s. Or you see the Midolino that is in the Federlegno stand. This is a really special material that has been produced. And then the austerity time with the oil crisis in the 70s up to the crisis of globalization in our time, and then self-production thanks to the new technology of the new communication technology. Finally, we come to the latest edition in 2015 about design in houses, where Italian design plays a major role. There's not just furniture, but other objects that seems ultra bodies, for example, electrical equipment, as productive and economic activities, we were first in producing these items, for example, coffee makers or other equipment for houses. So design is in the museum not just as a story, but as a story of a discipline, but also as a story of a country, our country. So this museum is at the same time representation and research. The main value is not just to have a rich collection as if the museum were a warehouse. No, we wanted to be able to put together culture, projects, economy, and the society. Gathering things, the fruits of our work, objects, material and immaterial objects of our history, is surely the task of a museum, especially of a museum that deals with everyday items, for example, the Design Museum. But the work of the Triennale Design Museum is something more. We really try to link the community and what is available in the community in private and state collections, in companies and other realities into one single space so that we can represent differences. It's sort of metaphor of Italy as a country of 1,000 municipalities, 1,000 towns. We try to put together different districts, for example, furniture district in the Brianza area, or in the Marche and Veneto and Friuli regions, or in the shoe industry in Tuscany, or in Marche region again, or car production in Imola, Pontedera, or sportswear in the Veneto region, or glasses again in the Veneto region, or taps and other items. Could continue this list. Well, there's so many museums about design in Italy, and some of them are important at an international level for tourists and for experts. For example, there's the Ferrari Museum in Imola, or Ferragamo's Museum about fashion in Florence, or about Vespa scooter in Pontedera, or the Alfa Romeo in Varese that's just been reopened, or another museum near Milan, or the Wood Museum in Cantu. I really could continue this list long over and over again. We have a big network. We have more than 60 museums connected to our museum. So, but this is maybe the reason why it was so late when the Design Museum in Italy was created. In each museum, we find part of the material history of our country, which is expressed in our work in the Triennale Museum. For example, when one visits the Riva Wood Museum in 1920, 1920 is the year of establishment of a company that really made history in Italy, with generations after generations that worked in the sector, and one is really more impressed by the tools rather than the objects that are produced. One understands how people worked, how they produce things, and they understand, they appreciate the history of the company, just like in many other companies in the Brianza district. One can really perceive the value of labor, of working hard to obtain results, and all the efforts for safety. Carpenters, really, many carpenters don't have one or more fingers in their hands, unfortunately. So there is a strong relationship of esteem and trust because we know that these people really played an important role in the economy of our country. So design is not just important because of aesthetics, but it's a meeting between know-how and design and ideas. Many times Italy is represented as a country full of bad people and just beautiful women and football players. Well, that's unfair. For sure, there's gaps, there's problems. We complain about Chinese people copying our products, but we forget that we are the second country in the world in terms of copying. And maybe we taught Chinese people how to copy, though we have to be careful now, because now in China, there's a lot of people graduating in design programs. So now there's new competencies emerging there. They don't just copy. We want to protect our made in Italy items with copyright programs, and we want to protect our people but one of the companies that lobbied in the parliament was really the cause for this weak legislation that we have in terms of patent protection in Italy. But anyway, we managed really to send so many beautiful things around the world. We responded to not just material needs, but also to view of the world that envisages a relationship with other people and with oneself. So the Triennale in Milano has been and wants to be the home of Italian and international design, a place for dialogue, even harsh dialogue, but concrete and open, to represent research, experimentation, and to celebrate when one may deserve to be proud of a history or a job. The Triennale of Milan was created to propose every 3 years of an international exhibition with important subjects involving applied art, architecture, visual arts, and design. I won't dwell on the reasons behind this, but it was interesting in 1996 to consider what happened in that edition, because the subject of 1966 is still really current: identity and difference. That was the main theme at the time. That's incredible. But next year, as we said, in 2016, the same story will be reproposed with an important subject at the same time. It's unavoidable. 21st century, design after design. That's the future theme. The 21st century as the century of design. There's a crisis everywhere, and there's peoples now that don't just need bread, so there is the need for projects, for things, for services, for solutions. And it's not by chance that more diffuse creative profession in the world is that of designers. So we really need to understand maybe if the world needs a new car, a new mobile phone, or even more so, new solutions for mobility and for connectivity. For example, when playing the tower game, maybe we should understand if it's more important to understand, is it more important the person who invented the mobile phone or the person who invented the car sharing service? So there's these interesting questions, these things that we would like to address in the next edition of our Triennale exhibition in Milan, because as Bruce Mau states, one of the most influential theorists of contemporary design, now that we can do anything, what can we do? Thank you for your attention.
Grazie, Direttore.
Thank you very much to Director Mr. Cancellato. So next year, you're all invited to visit the Triennale in Milano, which is in its new project. Okay, now I will leave the floor to a Russian architect, which is the head of the economic department of the Russian Orthodox Church. And he is in charge of a very important program, as in the building of new churches in Moscow. He will talk about that in detail. And his speech is entitled Faith, Architecture and Life. So I will give the floor to architect Mr. Yurevich.
Добрый день, дорогие друзья.
Good morning, everyone. When I was invited at the meeting to speak, I was very happy because not only am I an architect, but also I'm a man of the Russian Church. I looked at all the materials of the meeting for previous years, and I realized that in the meeting you tell the history of people, you tell the history of cultures, of religious faith, and you talk about their witnesses. And I thought that it would be interesting not only to talk about architecture and design, but also about something else. In my presentation, you won't see any professional pictures about contemporary architecture, but you see the life of people and buildings, and you will see a witness of my faith and my religion. I was born in an average family in Russia, in a Soviet family, to be honest. And we were somewhat peculiar in our family. We had a specific cultural roots. My parents were noble. My grandfather had served in the military in the Tsar. My grandmother went to a noble school, and my grandfather, for this reason, spent almost 30 years in lagers in Siberia, in those places where I also happened to live for a while. Then when I was young, I lived in Moscow. I was baptized when I was a kid, but my family didn't really live a very religious life. Yesterday, during the meeting with Father Lepori, I heard his wonderful ideas and words, which are the motto of this meeting, as in, what is the lack of, or heart? I think that there are many people that could talk about such an experience that maybe is similar to mine and to my life. And something similar to the Metropolitan Tony, and there's an exhibition about it here at the meeting. I have always asked myself some questions. Who am I? Where do I come from? What is this infinity of the world? What is there gonna be after my death? What is the meaning of life? My heart was always asking these questions. There was always something missing, but in the past, I didn't know what was missing. I came to know about it only later on. I've always been very optimistic and full of joy, but all these questions have always been inside me at the bottom of my heart. When I studied at school, I was pretty much interested in figurative arts, and then I studied architecture at university. As a wise architect, as a wise designer, I think that maybe someone for me has chosen this career. And very often on me, I felt that Christ was deciding for me. At university, I found out a wonderful world. The art of old Russia, of ancient Russia, frescoes, icons, churches, and then the religious culture worldwide. At that time, I have to remind you, I lived through the Soviet times, the age of stagnation, as we call it today. That was the 1970s, so there was atheism, religion was not permitted. Had the Soviet students seen us in churches, they could have kicked us out from university. I was able to learn many different things. Then I got married with a wonderful girl. This is my bride, Matyushka, that's her name. And through her, in her, I found my mate, my life mate. as a priest and as an architect, because we both studied architecture at university. So we had a lot of things in common. Our love story is a totally different story, so I'm not going to tell it to you. So I finished off university, then I started working in Moscow. And rather than working as an architect in those Soviet times, I started working on a few projects. In the meantime, we had our first daughter. My wife finished university. And at that point, we were at a crossroads in our life. So we lived in Moscow, the big capital of the country, but at some point, all of a sudden, we could no longer tolerate it. It was somewhat unbearable. That's because in Moscow, we couldn't be creative. There was a stagnation. We couldn't move. And at that time, we were 25 years old, and we decided to go away. Where? Where should we go? Many other Soviet people had already fled the Soviet Union and fled to the West, whereas we went to the East, to Siberia, 4,000 kilometers from Moscow. We were younger people coming from Moscow. At that time, we didn't travel much, so we started off to go to Siberia, to the Krasnoyarsk region. That was the place of the people deported at Soviet times. Even before that, during the Tsar period, there's the big river, a big river called the Yenisei, and we went to a very small town, 60,000 people, so there was nothing compared to Moscow. And in the 1960s, you could hardly see it, find it on maps. And that was the place where my grandfather had been deported. In Siberia, you can overflow the whole area, the whole territory, and you can hardly find one single human settlement. It's incredibly cold during the winter. Temperature can go down up to minus 50 Celsius degrees. Snow is incredible. Incredible amounts of snow everywhere. And with my wife, I lived there for almost 30 years, and we were very happy. Then we understood that God took us there. And what would happen in our future life could have not happened if we had lived in Moscow. But that happened just because we lived in Siberia. Here, this is a very simple town. There's no architecture. And I was very young, and 2 weeks after I got there, all of a sudden, I was the chief architect of this town. In Moscow, that would not have been possible. That was possible in Siberia. So, all of a sudden, there was this creativity on me creativity that I couldn't feel in Moscow. So I was able to work on my creativity. They told me, oh, okay, you can do whatever you want in the city. You can just build whatever you want. So here you see my first sketches for the houses. But I could do basically everything. And together with my beloved wife, we started to work. We were really enthusiastic. And after 40 years, I was already a member of the Architects' Order in the Soviet Union. And so we had our second daughter. Family grew up. We were able to be creative. We were young. We were 30. Everybody was respecting us. We were really appreciated by everybody. So we got double income compared to what we used to get in Moscow. We were healthy. We had friends. We had everything. Still, there were these questions at the bottom of my heart. My heart was still missing something, was longing for something. And all of a sudden, it was 1988, the year of jubileum for Russia, because that was the 1000th anniversary of Russia's conversion to Christianity. So we went to another town. We moved to another town nearby called Yeniseisk. That's the Florence of Siberia, as we call it. At Yeniseisk, there was a church. And there we met a wonderful person, a priest, Father Gennady Fast, who aroused our interest for religion. So we met him very often, and something surprising happened. After talking to him, he gave to us a small gospel, not Mark's gospel, which is the shortest one. That was John's gospel, a more complex one. And I took this gospel and I went to Moscow on holiday to see my parents. And while I was traveling there, I read this gospel. And these 2 weeks were incredible, where my transformation occurred. I was reborn. I know exactly the moment when I was born in Christ. For an Orthodox priest, this is not very common to say, but this is what happened. That was May 1989. I don't remember anything about the journey, except one thing. I was in the bus, there was the doors opening and closing, and I just remember myself reading this gospel with the words of the gospel, and the truth is God, and the truth is God. And I was struck by these words. So when I left from Siberia, when I was a non-believer, I went back to Siberia and I was a believer. And then things continued to develop very quickly. During the summer, I found the answers to all the questions that for 30 years of my life had upset me. That summer was the beginning of a new style in my architecture, of a new interest in my architecture. I started to combine architecture and faith. There was a competition to build up a big church hosting 10,000 people. That was an international competition for the Jubileum of Russia, for the 1000th anniversary of a transformation of Russia to Christianity. And in the slide you see me as an architect. And at the bottom you see my church, because I won that competition. And that was the beginning. That was the beginning of my activity as a sacred architect. Architect working for sacred art. After 2 years, in that church, in that parish, in Yeniseisk, I started working. I started working as a father, as a priest, with the children, with people. And after 2 years, I created a parish community. I set up a small group of 20 people who started working for the community. But who would be the president of that community? People were asking. Well, they chose me as the president of the community. And then we needed to choose a father, a priest, and everybody wanted me as the priest. So they wrote a letter to our bishop where they asked him to appoint me as a priest. And so I became a priest. Now you see my look, which is even more rigorous, stricter, and I became priest, chosen by my own community. So I started my activity as a priest and as an architect at the same time. I had to create a community and I had to build a church at the same time. Here you can see the first church that we built. That was our first church, our community, in Novosibirsk. A very poor one, just like Christ. That was like the cave where Jesus was born. That was an old barn. Only 50 people could be seated inside, and inside it was very crowded. In the summer it was very hot. And I was all dressed up with religious clothes and I was totally sweating. But we were very happy to have this church, even though it was a small one, because that was our first love. I moved, and because it's the souvenir of mine, it's my own memory, and it's all now in the distant past. It's something belonging to my past. That's why I feel a bit moved. But that was our rebirth, our second birth. After 1 year, they gave us another building, a second church. That was the former cinema. In Russia, there was a continuous perestroika, continuous renewal. And so the church was given old buildings that could be reconverted into churches, turned into churches. So there was a former cinema, former theater that was turned into a church. And that could host 300 people. The interesting thing is that there was a fire and everything burnt, outside and inside. But as some people said, all the non-pure things belonging to the past were burned. And so we rebuilt everything. And we started to think about a project to build a big church. So we found everything: sponsors, builders, all the people that participated in the building of the church and that were our friends as well. And this is the result. This is our wonderful church. A few pictures of our church that was built on the river Yenisei. You see the difference between the first church, the Bethlehem hut, and this church, which could host up to 2,000 people. And this is our community. This is inside. There is our bishop. And this is our church on the side of the Yenisei River. And the town was very small. And often we were asked a question, but why do you have such a big church for such a small town? And I often said, as an answer, well, the church must not be in line with the size of the town. So you see that this is very cold, but life continues. You see my beard. Beard gets frozen when it's very cold. During the winter, we were building the nativity, all in ice. It's like a crib. After 5 years, we also opened up a school, an Orthodox school, where we trained our students. It was a classical training. This is our theater. there was a Shakespeare's tragedy on stage, and this is a dance. I like working with the students and with young people. This is our summer camp on the river of Siberia. Then we used to stop on the side, and this is the Acapulco of Siberia, as we call it. Here we were celebrating the Mass. We used to put up tents, and we invited the local people to celebrate a Mass with us. This is the Brotherhood of Mercy that was carrying out social programs. And here you can see 3 families all together. Many children are missing in the picture. 36 people out of 3 families. And this is a nice thing. This is an example to be replicated elsewhere. So, our life was very simple. In our life, during our life, in our family, we had many children, and we understood that we could work very well with children. We, for example, designed specific programs for large families. And we used to think that having many children was quite normal. In Siberia, we also organized exhibitions of contemporary Sacred Art, and in 2010 we opened a permanent museum of contemporary Sacred Art. That was the second museum after the Vatican Museum. We used to call it that way. Thank you very much for your attention. So, this is life in Siberia. And then, after living in Siberia, we had 7 children overall. They are wonderful children. They have wonderful gifts. They were a gift to us. This is our family. Five years ago, we had to go away, to abandon Siberia. And we went back to Moscow, the capital. And this is our last memory of our life in Siberia. The second church that we dedicated to Saint Andrew, the Apostle. In this church, 1 week before leaving, I celebrated Mass. And this is Moscow and our life in Moscow. This is the church where we're now celebrating Mass in the capital. Look at the difference. Look at the difference between the church in Siberia and this church. But in any case, we had to start our life from brand new. And so we did. This is a group of families and the club of families we work with. These are the young people of our parish. Even if we're old, we still work with them. These are the dances in a cultural center in Moscow. And we continued working with architecture. My bishop told me, okay, Father Andrey, you are an architect. You still have to work on architecture. And now I'm going to start talking about architecture. At this period in Moscow, 4 or 5 years ago, they started building new churches. Because in Moscow, all churches are concentrated right in the city center, Whereas in other neighborhoods where people live and sleep, they don't even have one church. And so if they want to find a church, they have to travel for at least 1 hour. So the Patriarch decided to build 200 churches in the capital. Although now they're thinking about building 400, even 600, and I was entrusted with this task. I had to plan the building of these churches, and this is quite difficult because after 1917, Soviet authorities completely stopped architectural tradition, and now architects don't really know how to start when they have to build a church. Many people think that we have to go back to the past tradition, but how can we start again? So we're now designing traditional churches. There are many talented people working with us. Now I'm showing you different projects. And we are asking ourselves, what is the church of the 21st century? We have to go forward. Now things have changed. We have modern buildings around us. The city is totally different. So even churches must be contemporary. So let's say that our style is maybe a mix between tradition and contemporary art. To us, this is contemporary. Maybe this is not for you. These are more modern churches. Some people think that they are too modern even. And these churches are basically designed by young architects. There are competitions which are organized. Some churches are already being built. I'm no longer young, and I'm very happy because I'm giving young people the opportunity to act, to work, and at the same time I can talk about Christ and I can spread the word, Christ's word, through architecture. So you see, this is our architecture program. I always remember the words that somebody told me when I became a priest. He told me, so far you've been an architect of cold stone. From now on, you will be the architect of human souls. This is what he told me. So this is why my job is something that I do with people and I do for people, and my family is helping me in that. Thank you very much.
Grazie all'architetto Yurevich.
Thank you, architect Yurevich, for your wonderful presentation. It was really interesting to learn more about Russian life and culture, Russian culture. Let us now carry on considering Eastern culture. I would like to give the floor now to Father Francesco Braschi, who is president of the Russian Christian Association, and he is also director of the Ambrosian Library and director of the chair of Slavic Studies of the Ambrosian Library. He will talk about the relation between God and man in space through history and Christian culture from the origins, also referring to how design is conceived in the Bible. Thank you. Well, in fact, I don't think it's possible to use the full presentation I had prepared without reacting to what we have been listening to the previous presentations, because the first thing that comes to my mind, and that also is part of what I was thinking when I was invited to this debate, is this: what is the evidence that we can consider as a starting point of reality onto which really starting reflecting? And this evidence, even if this is possible to see just doing iconographic research online, well, the evidence of holy architecture, Eastern architecture, is loss of any common reference, a common language. There is extreme variation, extreme variety, and such a variety probably is still reflecting the combination of tradition and breakage of that tradition. But I think that this is even more so considering what Father Andrey told us. So the question that I was asking myself was, what could reference points be? What are the reference points that we could have? The first is a text of a monk of the Mount Athos, who is now dead, but who wrote in 1944 that the church within the monastery, Eastern monastery, has the objective of being the heart, the center of the monastery, just like in the Benedictine tradition. At the same time, in this way, this is identified as the heart inside the body, but the heart in the Oriental sense of the word. It's not just the mere center of feelings, affection, but the heart as the synthesis of the decision, of the capacity of thinking of people. And this Oriental monk continues, it is the duty of the church, of the temple, to demonstrate how everything is transfigured through Christ. The space, the whole space takes on a new meaning, the whole time takes on a new meaning. And why is this so? Because the holy conception of the Oriental Christian building considers this conception of the church as a microcosm. The church represents the whole universe. Consider the dome and the place. The dome is the sky, and then there's the space for the audience, that is the earth, and then the altar is the presence of God in the world. So one in that place is called to live an experience of fulfillment, of totality, but at the same time of redefinition of reality, starting from the evidence that Christ is among us. So the conception of holy space refers basically to the subject of incarnation. And considering this theme, what is that happens? So the conception of time within holy space is no more time that goes towards the end, towards death, but this time goes towards light. It's not by chance that the liturgical day starts with Vespers, that is, with the previous evening, not with the morning. So the movement is not from the rising sun until the end of the day, but it's just one single light that keeps burning, the little light representing the presence of Christ up to dawn, when the fullness of the sun rising gives back meaning to time. And that's the light that makes it possible to visualize the whole reality. And what is the movement that occurs within time? This can be perceived in Eastern services rather than Western services, because this part has been reduced a lot in Eastern services. Emilian of Simonos Petre says that the movement of monks in the choir is a sort of dance. It doesn't represent the difficulties that can be experienced in time, but it is the discovery of an order, of a grace, the beauty of a sense, because this is the movement of each member of God's populations, of God's peoples, where every person knows what he or she can does and contribute to the general harmony. So my question was, is this just an Eastern heritage? Does this exist anymore in our context? Did we lose it? Maybe yes, in part, but I was surprised when I read some statements in 2005 by Mario Botta, an architect, a Swiss architect, who also dealt with churches. And talking about the construction of churches that he designed, he wrote, "The city is the house of man. It's the place where man lives, works, establishes relations. Designing a cathedral today is an extraordinary opportunity because it means putting in the city a new awaited sign, a break. The cathedral tells us something about man, his deepness, and the resistance to today's contradictions. Building a cathedral," he said, "it means affirming the truth as presence." What does that mean, affirming the truth as presence? According to Botta, that means working in the hope of having a dialogue with the need for immensity that we all have, believers and non-believers alike. So that's the lack, that waiting that is able to fill our hearts. So it really looks like both Eastern and Western Church, at least according to the words of this architect, were making reference to a common point, which is the point of incarnation, the presence, the truth not as discourse, but the truth as a presence that must be acknowledged and that needs a space. All this also requires to find a meaning again for men's activities. Men's activities should not be considered just as a form of movement, of restlessness. Our first speaker mentioned identity crisis. And how do we respond to identity crisis? Well, we respond with something that starts moving again, that starts creating again. And what is it that makes us able to create something, do something that is not just accelerating our journey towards nothingness? In the second presentation, I was impressed by this design as a creation in the world, a Weltanschauung, something that you shows not just doing things, but also establishing relations and preparing, making objects that increases the possibility to have relations with others. And I was really reassured in this respect by a couple of texts that I would like to comment on in the Bible. The Bible doesn't really mention design directly, but it refers to the creation of craftsmanship. And there's a bit of a contradiction here, because the creation of the city was linked to Cain, and the city of Cain is the city is described as the product of somebody who goes against God. We can understand, because the ideal of Israel at the beginning is the ideal of a nomadic life. It is the ideal of the life of those who have always considered cities as a form of power that was hostile. Well, go and see Abraham's exhibition and you will understand this very well. But in this very city, from the lineage of Cain, the Bible says, those who start working the iron were born. They are the lineage of Cain, those also who start working bronze. But the use of bronze and iron and steel is a symbol of war. These are tools that implies the usage of power, of a tremendous power. So for man's creativity, there's no redemption. Should we have this idea? Well, the answer is no. In the Exodus, where there is the experience of liberation that is fundamental for the peoples of Israel, there is a wonderful text that is repeated a couple of times in the book. And it's a text in which God encourages those who will be called upon to build first the tent of meeting and then in future the temple in Jerusalem. And it is really worth reading some parts. God talked to Moses. Then the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Ur, the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills." Well, first there's this wonderful aspect. God calls Abraham by name, and the same is for the craftsman. That is, the person who will have to use his know-how is called through his name to create something that can create, not destroy, and has three features that are given by God himself to the craftsmanship. I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills. Wisdom and is the capacity to understand oneself. That's wisdom, the meaning of one's life. Then understanding, intelligence, is the capacity to understand the link between the self and the whole reality. And only after that there's science, that is knowledge, which is the more technical aspect, we would say, that what allows us to do things. And then he goes on saying to do this, to make this, with all kinds of skills, any kinds of projects, but also to carve, for example, to do, to make. So the craftsman is not just the person who designs, the architect is also the person who knows who he is, able to capture the connection between himself and the reality, having technical skills, but these are not just design skills, they also have to include a concrete capacity, the know-how, experimenting something concretely. And I remember now the picture of Father Andrey, who were, while talking to the head of the construction site there. And then there's this capacity to design that has two more features. The Bible says, "I have appointed Oholiab, son of Ahisamach, to help him." So here, the creator, the architect, needs a companion, needs a partner. There's nothing solitary here. Nothing is done on one's own. This is so different because we have this idea of the genius that works alone, but there is a company here that is fundamental to practice creativity. And the last aspect is this one, where he says, "I have given the ability and the skilled workers and also the spirit and the wisdom to teach. I have put in his art the gift to teach." That's the other aspect. So creativity as knowing who one is and be able to design, but also be able to teach. So the capacity of teaching and delivering this ability to look at reality is the major characteristic, the distinguishing feature of the true designer, the real architecture, the person who makes something contributing to the restructuring of the world, from cinema to the world to the church. That means giving incarnation its own visible evidence that can be experienced and can be found. I don't want to take more time because I think we have listened to many interesting comments that we can think about, but basically in this idea of recovering the know-how capacity, well, there's also a link to the experience of liberation of Israel, and there's also this link to the experience of liberation of men's creativity, the intelligence of understanding reality and the capacity of doing know-how and to do things together and to teach things. Well, I think that if we try and understand the synthesis of the self between history and culture, these are the fundamental dimensions of the artistic dimension, artistic experience. Thank you.
Grazie a Don Francesco Braschi per questo.
Thank you very much for your speech, and maybe for this summary, we might say a summary of what has been said this morning. Now, just to find a sort of fil rouge, what came to my mind is that the common characteristics of architects and designers show a person, show a professional that regardless of their own culture, is always working hard, is always hands-on. And a person that always has a function, the architect, the designer, always fulfills a function. Thank you very much to all the speakers for coming here this morning. And unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but if any one of you has some question to ask, you can approach them and ask them directly. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you.